The sound. That's the thing that haunts me the most. Not the bourbon burning a hole in my gut, not the fury that felt like it could split the world in two. It was the sound. The sickening crack of my leather boot connecting with the sacred oak of the altar at St. Michael's. I was Rick Callahan, the ex-mayor, the man who kicked God's table in the middle of a thunderstorm because I had no one else left to blame for my own damnation. The silver crucifix on the altar rattled like a dying man's last breath, and a vase of white lilies, my own mother's favorite, exploded into a shower of glass and petals. That sound, that sacrilegious boom, was the moment I severed the last thread connecting me to anything decent, anything whole. It was the night I declared war on silence and on the memory of a faith I had long since abandoned. My name is Rick Callahan, and I'm 62 years old. Or at least I was when this story truly began. I was born and raised right here, in a town built on steel and calloused hands, a place where you learn to be tough before you learn to read. We were a family of faith, or so it seemed. Church every Sunday at St. Michael's, my mother, Eleanor, a pillar of the Rosary Altar Society, her hands always smelling faintly of beeswax and lemon polish from her work in the parish. I was even an altar boy, my small hands fumbling with the bells, the scent of incense clinging to my clothes. I knew the rhythms of the Mass by heart, the Latin responses a secret language that felt ancient and powerful. But even then, there was a hardness in me, a pride that chafed against the humility the priests preached from the pulpit. I saw faith as a sort of weakness, a crutch for people who weren't strong enough to stand on their own. I believed in what I could build, what I could control, what I could win, and for a long time I won. If this story already resonates with you, if you've ever felt that conflict between the world you were raised in and the person you became, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the rest of this journey. Give this video a like and please share it with someone who might need to hear it. I'd also love to know who I'm talking to, so drop a comment below and let me know where in the world you're watching from. It means a lot to know we're all connected, no matter the distance. My rejection wasn't a quiet, internal struggle. It was loud, and it was mean. I built my political career on being the man with the answers, the man who didn't need prayers because he had plans. When my wife Eleanor would set up her small nativity scene at Christmas, I'd walk by and sneer, "Still talking to your little dolls, Elle." I remember one argument, a bitter one, where she was clutching her mother's rosary, praying for my success in an election. I snatched it from her hand, not violently but with a cold, dismissive motion. I held the delicate wooden beads and said, "You think these little things are going to beat the union vote? You think this piece of wood is more powerful than a handshake and a promise?" I saw the hurt in her eyes, a deep, profound wound that I had inflicted with my words. I dropped the rosary on the table as if it were contaminated. I didn't understand then that I wasn't just disrespecting her faith, I was disrespecting her hope. I was crushing the most beautiful part of her spirit with the heel of my own arrogance. That arrogance led me straight to the mayor's office, and for a while it felt like I was right. I was the king of my small, rusting kingdom. But pride is a demanding master, and it led me down a path of backroom deals and moral compromises. The kickback scandal didn't just break, it detonated, taking my career, my reputation, and my legacy with it. The town that had elected me their savior now saw me as a common crook. And on the Sunday after the story hit the front page, Father Michael, a man I'd known since I was a boy, stood at the pulpit of St. Michael's and delivered a sermon on the moral rot that infects men who place power before principle. He never said my name, he didn't have to. Every eye in that church, every whispered judgment in the pews, was a dagger pointed straight at my heart. I felt stripped naked, judged not by a jury but by the very institution my mother held sacred. The rage began to simmer then, a black, toxic brew of shame and indignation. That night, fueled by a bottle of bourbon, as a storm raged outside mirroring the tempest in my soul, I drove to the one place that represented it all. The church was empty, dark, save for the flickering sanctuary lamp. I broke in, my footsteps echoing like gunshots in the cavernous silence. I stood before the main altar, the one my mother used to polish, the one where I'd served as a boy. All I could see was Father Michael's face. All I could hear was the town's judgment, and I unleashed everything I had. My boots swung, and the world cracked open with that terrible final sound. It wasn't just wood I was kicking. It was my past, my family, my wife's heart, and any chance I had at redemption. In the ringing silence that followed, I stood there panting, a king of nothing in a desecrated sanctuary. The drive home was a blur of rain-streaked glass and the rhythmic slap of the windshield wipers, each one a tick of a clock counting down to a judgment I couldn't escape. When I walked through the door, soaking wet and smelling of bourbon and fury, Eleanor was waiting in the living room. She was sitting in her armchair, her mother's rosary wrapped around her knuckles, the little wooden cross pressed into her palm. She didn't have to ask where I'd been. It was written all over me, the mud on my boots, the wildness in my eyes. She just looked at me, and in her gaze I saw something far worse than anger or disappointment. It was horror, the kind of look you give something you once loved that has become monstrous, something you no longer recognize. She didn't say a word. She just slowly, deliberately unwrapped the rosary from her hand and placed it on the small table beside her. Then she stood up and walked past me, up the stairs, without a single touch, without a single word. The silence she left behind was more damning than any sermon, colder than any jail cell. That was the night our 40-year marriage truly ended. Not with a bang, but with a terrible, hollow quiet. In the weeks that followed, my world didn't just crumble, it evaporated. My children, who had stood by me through the scandal with strained loyalty, now called with a new distance in their voices. The conversations were short, sterile. They'd ask about my health in the same tone you'd ask about the weather. They couldn't look at me. I had not only shamed the family name with corruption, I had desecrated the memory of their grandmother, the very heart of our family's history. My old political allies, the ones who had slapped my back and shared my whiskey, suddenly had full calendars. My calls went to voicemail. I became a ghost in my own town. Men I'd known my whole life would cross the street to avoid me, their eyes fixed on the pavement. My pride, the fortress I had built brick by brick, was a ruin, and I was left wandering its empty halls, a king of dust and echoes. The silence I had declared war on in that church had followed me home, and it had won. It filled every room, sat at the dinner table, and lay beside me in my empty bed. And then, my body began its own rebellion. It started with a tickle in my throat, a cough I dismissed as a side effect of too much cheap bourbon. But the cough didn't go away. It deepened, became a rattling, raw thing that would shake my whole frame. I started losing weight. My suits, once tailored to project an image of power and confidence, hung on me like a scarecrow's rags. I was a man who had always believed in the force of his own will, that I could bend reality to my liking. I'd ignored the doctor's warnings years ago, dismissed the shadow on an early X-ray as a fluke. I was Rick Callahan, I didn't get sick. Sickness was for the weak, but cancer doesn't care about your name or your past accomplishments. It is the great equalizer. It came for me not with a sudden attack, but with a slow, methodical siege, breaking down my body's defenses, one by one until I had nothing left to fight with. The day I collapsed trying to climb the stairs was the day I surrendered. I ended up in a ward at the county hospital. Not a private room with a view, but a bed in a beige room I shared with the hum of a fluorescent light and the faint smell of bleach and despair. My window looked out onto a brick wall. This was my new reality. Stripped of my tailored suits, my title, my name, I was just a body in a bed, a chart on a clipboard. The pain was constant, a low, burning fire in my chest that no amount of morphine could fully extinguish. In the long, sterile nights, when the only sounds were the squeak of a nurse's shoes in the hallway and the rhythmic beeping of the machine beside me, the loneliness became a physical presence. It was a suffocating weight on my chest, heavier than the cancer itself. I had no one. Eleanor didn't visit. My children called, but their voices were thin, distant, like echoes from a life I no longer lived. My allies were gone. All the power, all the influence, all the handshakes and promises. They were meaningless here. In this room, I was nothing. I would lie there staring at the ceiling, and for the first time in my life I felt the cold, hard certainty of utter failure. I was going to die, and I was going to die alone, remembered only as a corrupt, bitter old man who kicked an altar in a fit of rage. The fear was an animal, clawing at the inside of my ribs, and there was nowhere to run. It's a dark place to be, that kind of absolute emptiness. If this story is touching something in you, if you've ever felt a loneliness that deep, I hope you'll stick with me for the rest of this journey. Hit that like button if you would, and make sure you have the notification bell turned on, because what happened next in that very room is something I still can't fully explain, but it changed everything. It was on the third night, or maybe the fourth. The days had started to melt into a single grey continuum of pain and fluorescent light, that it happened. The fever had taken hold, making the thin hospital blanket feel like a lead shield, and the brick wall outside my window seemed to sway and breathe. I was floating in that murky space between consciousness and delirium, a place where memories and nightmares danced together. I saw my mother's hands polishing the altar. I saw Eleanor's face pale with horror. I heard the crack of my boot over and over, a sound that had become the metronome of my damnation. I was convinced this was it. This was hell, not fire and brimstone, but a beige room and an endless loop of your greatest failures. I closed my eyes, not in prayer, but in surrender. I was tired of fighting. I just wanted the noise to stop. And then, it did. The beeping of the monitor faded. The distant clatter of a cart in the hall vanished. Even the fire in my own chest seemed to bank, replaced by a profound, absolute silence. It wasn't the empty silence of my house, or the judging silence of the church. This was a living quiet, a silence that felt full like a held breath. I opened my eyes. The room was no longer grey. It was filled with a soft, pearlescent light, a luminescence that seemed to emanate from the foot of my bed. And standing there in the heart of that light was a woman. She wasn't an angel with wings, not some grand figure from a stained glass window. She was just a presence. Cloaked in something that looked like pure white, her face was serene, etched with a compassion so deep it felt ancient. She looked at me and I felt utterly seen. Not as the mayor, not as the crook, not as the angry old man who kicked an altar. She saw the terrified boy inside, the one who fumbled with the altar bells, the one who had lost his way so completely he'd forgotten there was a way to begin with. I tried to speak, to ask who she was, what she wanted, but my throat was a desert. Only a dry, rasping sound came out. I felt a surge of pure animal terror. Was this a fever dream? A hallucination brought on by the morphine? My rational mind, the part of me that had built a career on facts and figures, was screaming that this wasn't real. But the rest of me, the part I had starved and ignored for 50 years, knew it was. Knew it with a certainty that defied all logic. She didn't move her lips, but I heard her voice, not in my ears, but inside my soul, a sound clearer than any I'd ever heard. It was a simple thought, a single wave of understanding that washed over me and cleansed everything in its path. The noise of your pain, she communicated, was louder than the crack of your anger. And in that moment, the dam broke. The decades of pride, the carefully constructed walls of arrogance, the bitter justifications, they all crumbled into dust. I saw my sin for what it was, a desperate, pathetic scream from a man drowning in his own misery. She wasn't judging me. She wasn't condemning me. She was telling me she had heard the real sound, the sound beneath the sound. She had heard my heart breaking. The shame was a physical force. It buckled me, a wave of heat that flushed my skin and brought tears to my eyes for the first time since my mother's funeral. Not tears of self-pity, but tears of profound, gut-wrenching sorrow for the man I had been, for the pain I had caused, for the love I had thrown away. I wept like a child, my body shaking with ragged, silent sobs. I wasn't just crying for kicking an altar. I was crying for snatching the rosary from my wife's hand, for sneering at her faith, for every casual cruelty born of my own emptiness. And through it all, her presence remained, a beacon of calm in my storm. She didn't offer words of comfort. She didn't need to. Her presence was the comfort. It was forgiveness made visible. It was mercy standing in a county hospital room just for me. And then, as gently as it had arrived, the light began to fade, receding back into the grey reality of the room, leaving me alone, but no longer empty. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was peaceful. The loop of my failure had been broken. I lay there for a long time, the tears drying on my face, the weight of a grace I didn't deserve settling over me. The terror was gone, replaced by an urgent, desperate need. I fumbled for the call button, my hand shaking. A young nurse came in, her expression weary. I need a priest," I rasped, my voice raw. "I need to see Father Michael, from St. Michael's. Please, it's important." She looked at me, probably thinking the old man in bed 3 was finally losing it completely. But she must have seen something in my eyes, a frantic sincerity that cut through the haze of sickness. She nodded and left. The hours that followed were the longest of my life. I was terrified I would die before he got there, that I would lose this one final chance. Every squeak of a shoe in the hall made my heart leap. What I have to tell you about what happened when he arrived, it's the core of everything. It's where a vision became a reality. If you are still with me on this journey, please take a second to hit that like button and make sure you've turned on notifications, because the story isn't over. Not by a long shot. When Father Michael finally walked through the door, he looked older than I remembered. The lines on his face were deeper, etched by the burdens of a town that had seen its share of broken promises, many of them mine. He carried a small black bag, and his steps were slow, deliberate. He stopped a few feet from my bed, his expression unreadable. For a moment we just looked at each other, two old men on opposite sides of a chasm I had created. The old Rick, the one who had ruled this town with an iron will and a silver tongue, wanted to rise up and meet his gaze with defiance. That part of me, that stubborn, prideful core, was screaming inside my head. "What are you doing, Callahan? Are you really going to grovel before this man? The man who called you out in front of the whole town? This is weakness. It was the morphine, you fool. A fever dream. Tell him you made a mistake. Tell him to get out." The voice was so loud, so familiar. It was the voice that had driven me my whole life, the one that told me compassion was a liability and faith was a crutch for the feeble-minded. For a split second, I almost listened. I could feel the sneer forming on my lips, the old familiar armor of sarcasm rising to protect me. A hallucination. That's what it was. A dying brain's last, desperate fireworks show, a comforting lie to ease the passage into nothingness. It was the only explanation that made sense, the only one my logical, fact-based mind could process. A woman made of light, a voice inside my soul. It was the stuff of cheap pamphlets and Sunday school stories I'd mocked my entire adult life. I had built a world on what I could see, touch, and control. And this was none of those things. It was an illusion, a trick of the light in a sterile beige room. But then I looked past Father Michael, toward the grimy window and the brick wall beyond it. And I remembered the feeling, the certainty. The absolute, undeniable reality of that presence. It had felt more real than the cancer eating me from the inside out. It was more real than the political victories and the backroom deals. It was the most real thing I had ever experienced. The memory of her compassion was a physical warmth in my chest, a stark contrast to the cold terror that had been my constant companion. I'd had a feverish dream while waiting for the priest, a fleeting image of the white lilies from the altar. In my dream, they weren't shattered on the floor. They were whole, pristine, glowing with that same impossible light, their petals unfurling in slow motion. It was just a dream, my rational mind screamed, but my soul knew it was a message, a symbol of restoration, a promise that what was broken could be made whole. The battle raging inside me was the real war, the one that truly mattered. If you've ever felt that kind of internal struggle, let me know you're still here with a quick like on the video, and make sure your notifications are on so you can see how this confrontation ends. The shame that followed was a physical tide, rising from my gut and burning my throat. I saw myself years ago walking through the living room at Christmas. Eleanor had just finished setting up her small, simple nativity scene on the mantel. I'd stopped, a glass of whiskey in my hand, and looked at the little painted figures. "Still playing with your dolls, Elle?" I'd said, the words dripping with a casual, condescending cruelty. I didn't even look at her face. I just took a drink and walked away, pleased with my own cleverness. Now, lying in that hospital bed, I could see her face as if she was standing right there. A flicker of hurt in her eyes, the way her shoulders slumped just a little, the quick, silent way she absorbed the blow and pretended it didn't matter. How many thousands of those little cuts had I inflicted over the years, each one a small murder of the spirit? I remembered her hands, her beautiful, capable hands, clutching her mother's rosary beads as she prayed for me during the scandal. I remembered my own hand snatching them away, dismissing her hope as childish superstition. I had called her faith a weakness, when all along it had been her greatest strength. It was the bedrock that allowed her to endure living with a man like me. And I, the strong one, where was I now? A broken, wasted thing in a paper gown, begging for the very man I had tried to humiliate. The arrogance of it all was staggering. I, who had kicked God's table, was now desperate for a crumb of the mercy I had spent a lifetime mocking. The hypocrisy was a poison in my veins, my eyes filled with tears, hot and shameful. "Father," I croaked, and the sound was so weak, so pathetic, it barely sounded like my own voice. "Father, I need to make a confession." His expression softened. The hard lines of judgment I had imagined were not there. There was only a weary sadness, the look of a man who had seen more than his share of human frailty. He pulled a small chair to the side of the bed and sat down. He didn't rush me. He just waited, creating a space of silence for me to fill with the wreckage of my life. My heart hammered against my ribs. To speak the words, to say it all out loud, felt like leaping from a cliff. It meant admitting that my entire life, my entire philosophy, had been a catastrophic mistake. It meant surrendering the last vestiges of my pride, the final tattered flag flying over the ruins of Fort Callahan. It was the hardest thing I'd ever had to do. My confession in that hospital room wasn't an ending. It was a violent, painful birth. I poured out decades of poison, the casual cruelties, the grand betrayals, the deep, rotting pride that had masqueraded as strength. I told Father Michael everything, right down to the sickening crack of my boot against the altar. When I was finished, I was hollowed out, an empty vessel, expecting a lecture, a penance, a final condemnation. Instead, he simply placed his hand on my head and absolved me. The words were ancient, but for me they were brand new, washing over me like clean water. And something shifted, not just in my soul, but in my body. The doctors couldn't explain it. The next morning, the fever was gone. The day after that, the inflammation markers in my blood had plummeted. They called it a spontaneous remission, a 1 in a million fluke. They used a lot of big words, but I knew what it was. It was mercy, made tangible in my own cells. When I finally walked out of that hospital, leaning on a cane, 20 pounds lighter and 100 years older, the world looked different. The story, of course, had gotten out. Whispers travel fast in a small town. The version that reached most people was a garbled mess. The disgraced mayor, dying of cancer, had a breakdown in the hospital and started seeing things. My old political rivals had a field day. "Poor Rick," they'd say with false sympathy. The guilt finally cracked him. My own children, bless their hearts, tried to be gentle. "Dad, the morphine can cause powerful hallucinations. We read about it." They were trying to protect me, to give me a rational way out, to save me from further embarrassment. Even my neighbors would look at me with a mixture of pity and suspicion, as if I were a fragile thing that might shatter, or a crazy man who might start shouting on the street corner. They'd corner me at the grocery store, their voices low. "Rick, are you okay? We heard you had some kind of episode." And the old me, the fighter, the debater, would have been right there, ready to argue, to prove my point, to win. But that man was gone. I would just look at them, my gaze steady, and say, "I've never been more okay in my life." What I saw in that room was more real than this can of beans in my hand. I wouldn't argue, I wouldn't try to convince them. How could I explain a color to a blind man? How could I describe the sound of mercy to ears that had only ever heard the noise of the world? My certainty was quiet, but it was absolute. It was the new foundation on which I was building the ruins of my life. I started going back to St. Michael's, not to the front pew where the mayor used to sit, but to the last row near the doors, like a visitor who didn't want to intrude. At first, people stared, but I kept coming. I didn't go for them. I went for the silence. The same silence I had once declared war on now felt like a comforting blanket. I would sit there, long after the Mass was over, and just look at the altar. My altar, the one I had desecrated. The parish had it repaired, but if you looked closely, you could still see a fine line in the oak, a scar. It was my scar, a reminder of what I was, and of the grace that had found me anyway. I joined a small men's prayer group that met on Tuesday nights in the church basement. They weren't powerful men. They were mechanics, teachers, shop owners. They didn't care that I was the ex-mayor. They just knew I was a man who was hurting and searching. In their company, holding the simple wooden rosary that Sister Agnes had given me, my mother's rosary, the beads no longer felt like a superstitious trinket. They felt like an anchor, each bead a moment to be quiet and listen. The statue of Mary in the corner was no longer a plaster doll. It was a reminder of the face of compassion that had looked at me without an ounce of judgment. The turning point came a year later, at the annual parish festival. The whole town was there. It was a hot summer evening, the air thick with the smell of grilled sausage and cotton candy. I was just helping clear tables, feeling a simple joy in the work, when Father Michael came over and put a hand on my shoulder. "Rick," he said, "I think there are some people who need to hear your story. From you." He led me to the small, makeshift stage. 100 conversations died down. 100 faces turned to look at me, the town pariah. My heart was pounding. The old pride screamed, "Don't do it. Don't make a fool of yourself." But another voice, a quiet one, whispered, "Tell them what is real." I gripped the microphone, my knuckles white. "Most of you know who I am," I began, my voice trembling slightly. "You know me as your former mayor, and you know me for other things, for my pride, for my fall." I took a deep breath. I was a man who thought faith was a weakness. I mocked it. In my own home, I belittled the woman I loved for her prayers. In my rage, I came into that sacred church, and I committed an act of violence born of pure, pathetic arrogance. I saw Eleanor in the crowd, her face pale. I looked right at her. "I am so sorry," I said, the words catching in my throat. I spent my life chasing power, and it left me with nothing. I ended up in a hospital bed, alone, dying, and full of a rage that had poisoned my soul. I had nothing left. And in that nothingness, I continued, my voice growing stronger, in that place of absolute despair, I was shown a mercy I had done nothing to deserve. I can't explain it in a way that will satisfy your reason. I can only tell you what I know, that the very God whose table I kicked, the very Holy Mother whose name I used as a curse, they did not abandon me. They met me in the filth of my failure and lifted me up. The thing I rejected, the faith I called a crutch, was the only hand strong enough to pull me from the wreckage. My life didn't change because I found a new religion. It changed because I was found by a love that makes no sense. It's a love that transforms pride into humility, and a bitter, rebellious heart into one that can finally be at peace. If this story, this testimony of a broken man finding a grace he never earned, has touched something in your own heart, I'd be so grateful if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. And please, turn on the notification bell so you don't miss what we share here. But more than that, I want to build a community in these comments. So I ask you, and I ask this with all the sincerity in my soul, have you ever felt a moment of grace when you least expected it or least deserved it? A moment that changed your path? Please, share your story below. I truly believe that in the end, it's these quiet stories of mercy that hold our broken world together.